Hey everyone, and since I took a look at GNOME 1 recently, I thought it was only right that I also took a look at the first version of KDE. And this one is a surprising one, because while all the building blocks that you know about KDE right now are in there, it also was a pretty bare-bones experience that, in my opinion, still compared favorably to the Windows 95 and Windows 98 desktops of the time. So we're gonna take a look at KDE 1 today, just for fun and for nostalgia's sake, even though, as always, I've never tried that one because I started using Linux when GNOME 2 was a thing. All this footage is recorded using RX, not RTX. It is a distro that, as far as I can tell, is discontinued. It is a modern Debian base, but with that very old KDE 1.1 running on it. Thanks to a viewer for sending me this one. Now we're gonna start with our sponsor, and then we're gonna get right into it. This video is sponsored by Proton Drive. You all know about Proton Mail and Proton VPN and Proton in general. They're your all-in-one, end-to-end and zero-access encrypted suite of services focused on protecting your privacy and making sure that only you can access your data. But they do have Proton Drive, which has a bunch of storage space for you to store your files, folders, and also photos in there. Because yes, Proton Drive now supports photo albums. You can create new albums, store your photos in them, categorize things, but you can also share those albums and invite others to view them or to contribute to them. You can also mark photos as favorites so you can find them back later. You can get started with a free Proton account. You'll get your own email address, contacts, calendar, storage space, access to VPN, and Proton Pass for password management, and you'll get 5 gigs of free storage. And then you can upgrade to paid plans for more. I use Proton myself for my own personal email, for my calendars, for my contacts, my passwords, and also some amount of file storage. If you want to try them out, the link, as usual, is in the description. Okay, so now let's take a look at the first version of KDE. Although it is 1.1.2, which is the final version of the KDE 1 series, but this one really did not last for long, so it's basically the same as the first one that was ever released. So here you have your desktop shell. It is very familiar if you're a KDE user, but there are some differences. You've got your nice little menu, which is very much in the Windows 98 or 95 style. You've got here all of your workspaces, although you do have 2 applets to manage that. You've got that pager here, and you've got that list here. You've got a quick shortcut to your file manager and your personal folder. You've got the KDE Control Center, which will look pretty familiar to current KDE users. And you have a bunch of other shortcuts for various apps, plus your system tray, your clock, and some buttons to collapse the panel in one place or the other. You'll also notice that the taskbar is at the top. This is not something that we see today, although you can definitely make that layout if you want. The taskbar was not integrated with the main panel yet. You'll also notice something pretty awful, which is that it did not have font smoothing of any kind, so things look really choppy and jagged everywhere. I don't know if that's a fault of the distro I'm using, or if it's just KDE did not have any font smoothing, but looking at the font options, there is no way to make that smoother, so I think it just did not support any form of font smoothing or subpixel arrangement or whatever else. Now that was the default shell, but you could change things a little bit. First, you had the option to draw widgets like Windows 95 or to use the more motif style of things, which I think looks god-awful and is really hard to select, so Windows 95 style it is. You also had an option to make things look a bit like macOS with that global menu bar, something that still survives today, although fewer and fewer applications that are not pure KDE or Qt apps have access to that nowadays. Back in the day, it worked. Basically all the apps that were shipped on this distro worked with it, and you also had your little menu up top here if you wanted that. Now, one thing that KDE did not have all that much is the panel configuration. So sure, you could tweak the panel, put it on another space, on another place on your screen. You could have a tiny or normal style or large style. You could hide the taskbar or display it at the bottom on top of the main panel. You could have it hidden. You had a few options here and there, but generally you could not configure the entire panel as you wanted. What you had is a panel menu, which lets you add app shortcuts or some stuff for the help, the trash can, and refreshing the desktop to make sure that the icons or files you placed in there worked well and were properly displayed. But you did not have any real control over how things were displayed. For example, there was no way to completely remove a menu. You could decide to not have the window list in there or to have it, but you didn't have a bunch of applets that you could add and tweak and change positions. You were pretty much locked in here. You could, of course, move elements to other places if you wanted that. That's at least supported. So you could decide to not have all those things in the same layout, but it was still very bare bones compared to today. You also had no desktop widgets yet. Obviously, this wasn't a thing back in the Windows 95 or 98 days. That's a theme that we'll notice throughout KDE 1. It was not very configurable compared to even the first version of GNOME that we tested on this channel or current KDE. It just did not have the same breadth of options, and it really felt like it was a first product to try and replace the CDE desktop environment that was used widely on all Unix-compatible systems back in those days, but it really wasn't the full vision of the KDE team. It was a first iteration. Something that was a thing in this version is the Alt plus drag, something that even Windows back in the day did not have, and they still don't have it. You press Alt and you click anywhere on the window, and you can move it around, which is useful because this task list covers the title bar of Windows, so you kind of need to have that to make things better. But this is a feature that still remains today, although it's used with Super, and that other mainline desktops like macOS or Windows just do not have by default. And I don't understand why those systems do not have access to it. This is a simple feature that makes life so much easier on a desktop that I don't understand why it doesn't exist. You also had your Alt-Tab switcher, although it was a pretty weird looking one with very small icons and it had zero mouse interaction whatsoever, but you still had that feature. Also, since resolutions back in the day were pretty bad, you had an option to unclutter your windows, to maybe try and maximize what you could see of the currently focused windows. It's not great, it's not like window tiling, because that didn't exist, you couldn't just drag a window to tile it, but it was something. You could also cascade windows to make sure that all of them had at least one visible element that you could click on to make sure that you could select at least one of those windows. You also had this interesting desktop or virtual desktop pager, which floated on top of your desktop. It was an application, not a system feature, but you actually saw your real windows moving in real time and you could drag them to other desktops if you wanted to, which I think is cool functionality for the day. I'm not sure other desktop environments had something as what you see is what you get than this. Interestingly, you also had some neat animations. When minimizing a window, you saw its outline being minimized. It wasn't like GPU accelerated or anything, so they couldn't do anything too crazy, but you could also have a very nice and smooth maximize animation, which still looks pretty awesome to this day, I think. So all in all, it was a very competent desktop shell. It was not up to the level of customization that you might expect from KDE today, or even that the first version of GNOME that released, I think, a year after KDE had. GNOME 1 was way more customizable than KDE 1 ever was, but it still was a very competent shell. It had a lot of options, and it worked really smoothly and nicely. I think, having used Windows 95 and 98 back in those days, I would say KDE 1 compares favorably to those experiences, honestly. Now, as per the default apps that KDE came with, there was a big selection of games. Back in the day, everyone wanted to have a bunch of games on their systems, and KDE definitely delivered. And we also saw the first K stuff starting to appear. K Black Box, Conquest, and stuff like that. This is something that we didn't see on all applications yet. Not everything was K something. They actually had a normal naming convention with something called Media Player, Mail Client, Paint, Image Viewer. Nowadays, everything is K something or something with a K somewhere in the name, but yeah, back in the day they understood that an application was better recognizable if it was named after the function it served instead of having a cryptic K-based name. Now, you did have some competent applications. You had a Microsoft Paint clone, simply called Paint. It was really not that bad, although it was called K-Paint, but it wasn't called that in the menu. You could just basically do some shapes. Yes, you could draw a circle, easier than what the GIMP lets you do today, basically. You also had an email client, which I actually did try on the root account of this distro, and it still manages to get some of my email on POP3, because of course it was POP3. It crashed a lot while trying to get those emails, and it basically managed to pull one after crashing, but it does render it correctly and it sort of works. So that was the first version of Kmail. What KDE did not have is its own web browser. No web browser ships in this specific distribution, although I'm sure distros that shipped KDE 1 did have something like Mozilla, the first version. What it did do is use its own file manager as the web browser, because yes, back in those days, you basically had systems not really figuring out the whole internet thing, and so they thought a browser could browse files and also the internet, which why not? Interestingly enough, it does open a weird version of google.com, and it even prompts you with alerts to reject or accept cookies, which is something most browsers just do automatically in the background now. I think it's better this way, basically. This thing of file manager and web browser will be retained in KDE 2 and KDE 3 with Conqueror, which will replace this, I think it's called K-File Manager or KFM. This will be replaced by Conqueror in future releases of KDE, KDE 2 and 3, and this did handle web browsing and file management, and I actually used it for a long while as my main web browser. It used WebKit, well, it was called KHTML, which is the base for WebKit. It was a KDE-led project before Apple turned it into WebKit and basically grabbed control of that fork of it. So it was an interesting direction, and I wish they could have kept going with this, because having a all-in-one tool that could open one tab for your file manager and one tab for your web browser is not a bad experience. Now, specifically, that file manager was not really fantastic. You did have a tree view, which is always nice. You could show hidden files, you could show thumbnails or icons. You had a bunch of view options, but it really did not have many configuration options. Basically, it was options for the web browsing aspect, but that's about it. You also had a nice little terminal, which for some reason defaulted to a white background. Fortunately, you could change that with various color schemes, although it was also very, very bare bones. No profiles, nothing like that, even though this was definitely something that already existed back in those days. And you had the most cryptic menu editor I've ever seen, which actually opens with its manual pre-opened because it was such a nightmare to understand. Basically, you had to click on various options and then right-click them, and then you could maybe start trying to edit stuff, but I never really kind of figured it out. Like, yes, I can view, but how do I modify stuff? I should have read the manual, I guess. So not a giant application selection, but it did everything you would expect. It did email, which was the way of communicating with others. It did internet, file management, media playback, console. Everything you actually wanted to use was baked in there. Although these were very, very simple versions. When you compare that to the KDE of today, which is chock full of options on every single app and every single setting or panel or element, this was not that. And that's also something that we can verify in the settings themselves. You can definitely recognize this as the KDE Control Center. It is a shell to host various configuration modules, and that's about it. And this is actually where you find all the sessions and the options for the terminal itself, not in the terminal app. They are in the main settings for some reason. You could actually change the color scheme of the desktop, much like what Windows offered, I think in Windows 98. Don't remember if 95 had that, but you had a bunch of pre-established color styles, basically, that mimicked some stuff that you might have used in the day, or just looked weirdly different if you preferred, including a Windows 95 style look if you really wanted to emulate that. And you had full-on themes, meaning those would change a lot of stuff, much like the current KDE Plasma themes that can change your entire desktop layout. This didn't do that, but it did change the colors, the wallpapers, the panel itself, the sound themes, etc. It was a big change, and you had a bunch of those. And they actually had some interesting window decorations, as you can notice on the corners here. This wasn't terrible. Sure, it looks pretty garish today, and I would not use any of those on my main current box, but this isn't absolutely horrendous. This is actually a good level of customization here. You also had everything that you might expect from the KDE Info Center today, with a list of your devices and various informations about the ports that you have, the RAM, how it is used, how your system is partitioned, the CPUs that you use, stuff like that, and even the good old X server, although there was no graphical way to change that. You had to use the command line and a text file. Yes, those were the nightmare days of configuring your system. If the resolution wasn't the right one, you had to edit the configuration file. It was very tricky to do properly, and if you misconfigured things, you could potentially completely kill your entire monitor if things were done incorrectly. So, not something for the faint of heart, and I'm really glad we moved past that, because that sucked. Now, KDE used their own window manager, but it wasn't KWin, it was KWM. It was a precursor to KWin, but not yet KWin. You did have a few options to basically set window rules. You could add some certain rules if the window title matched something, or if the window class matched something, and you could decide to remove decorations, to have smaller decorations, to sticky those windows, to not show them in the session management. You could also change where the window controls were placed, even though it wasn't drag and drop or anything, you just decided where you actually wanted to place those buttons. And you had a lot of options for how you use your mouse. And I realized that now that, yes, you could actually resize with a middle mouse click and the Alt key. So this was already something implemented in there. It was just by default on the Alt plus right button, not the middle mouse button. So this is also something way in advance from what Windows did. And also super smooth resize, which systems of the day were really bad at. So that's a pretty cool feature here. Finally, the title bar was also relatively customizable. You could align stuff, you could change how it looked if you shaded that vertically or horizontally, but that's just the color gradient on top of this. Basically simple stuff, but you could also change the animations if you wanted to do that, the speed of those animations. So it definitely did not have as many customization options as what KDE had today, but it had more than enough. I think it even had more than what Windows actually offered back in those days. This was a very competent first implementation. Sure, it's 1.1.2, not 1.0, but I don't think they added 90% of those options in two major releases or minor releases. So this was a competent offering, and it did really, really well, especially compared to Windows 95 and 98, at least from what I remember of those. What's interesting is that GNOME, the first version of GNOME, was way more customizable than KDE. You could completely revamp the panels, create new ones, and change the entire layout of the desktop, which KDE didn't really let you do. You could add those global menus and move the taskbar around, but you couldn't really play around with applets, with changing where the panel is, how it looks, how it feels, what it contains, how many panels you want. This was not a thing. Although it is not fair to compare my experience with GNOME 1.4 that I tried on the channel, the video is somewhere up top or in the link in the description, it is not fair because GNOME 1.4 is a release that happened 2 years after this release of KDE that I tried. Still, it felt like GNOME had a much more modular approach to what KDE was doing. It let you change the window manager because they didn't have their own, so you could use whatever you wanted, but they gave you the configuration options to access the tools to manage that window manager. When KDE did their own, but it was bare bones compared to the ones that you could get on GNOME, for example. At the time, KDE was not very well received. Not because it was bad or anything, but because it used Qt, and it used the free license version of Qt, which was not open source, and a lot of people had a lot of concerns about what this meant for developing open source applications. Was it compatible? Was it not? This is something that followed KDE all the way through the KDE 3.5 lifecycle, where people still argued that KDE couldn't really be open source because Qt wasn't really open source and they depended on a special company. This is actually what prompted GNOME to be developed, because people wanted that new, fresh desktop compared to CDE, which was really old and started getting long in the tooth, but they did not want to rely on a semi-proprietary, not fully open source toolkit. So they created GTK for the GIMP, and they used that to create GNOME. Now, KDE 1 was not a long-lasting version of KDE. Basically, 1.1.2 was released a year and a month after the first version of KDE. This was the final one, and then they moved on to KDE 2 immediately after, which was only really used for a year, and then they moved to KDE 3, and this one lasted for much, much longer. Now, when you look at it today, it feels bare bones and it looks pretty bad and it's not a great experience. But back in the day, this was a pretty complete one. I didn't use it back in the day, but I used Windows 95 and Windows 98, which released, I think, a month after KDE, or KDE released a month after Windows 98. This is as competent as what I remember Windows 98 to have been. It has probably more options, it has probably more customization, even though it's limited compared to what you would expect from KDE. It was a really solid experience. What really held KDE back is the fact that it ran on a Linux distro of those days. Those were not as compatible as what you have today. The hardware of the day just ran not that well with Linux pre-installed on it. A bunch of stuff did not have any drivers for it, and you had to configure a lot of stuff manually. That's where Windows really shone. This was not a Windows has a better GUI thing. This was Windows is way easier to install, and it has the drivers, and it's actually supported on your computer when Linux really isn't in a lot of cases. So Linux didn't grow, but that wasn't really because KDE or even the first version of GNOME were subpar. They were, in my opinion, better than the offerings of old Mac OS 9 and Windows 98. But those were held back by the fact that Linux as a base system just was super tricky to install and to configure. What's also interesting is that KDE was not the configurable option. It was a simple default layout that you could tweak a little bit, more than you could tweak Windows, but not that much. GNOME was the super modular and configurable experience back in those days. And then things slowly changed. GNOME 2 was not as configurable as GNOME 1, although it did have a lot of options. KDE 2 started being a bit more configurable, and then KDE 3 released and had all the options you could expect to tweak everything you ever wanted. And this trend continued with KDE being really stocked full of options, and GNOME slowly moving into a more focused, specific direction. And now those two are really different, and it's, I think, a better ecosystem for it. So this will complete our small look at KDE 1. This is pretty fun to do, I think. I like making those videos. I like looking at the older ways of handling computers, and you realize that things really haven't changed that much. Graphically and aesthetically, sure, things look 1,000 times better now. It's probably more stable, it's probably performing better with GPU acceleration, you have more options, it's probably a bit more fluid, but the general computing paradigm really hasn't shifted. It's a panel, it's a menu, it's app launchers and a taskbar. Even if you use GNOME today, it's still a way to launch applications, which is pressing the super key or opening the app grid. It's still handling windows and switching between them by pressing another key and clicking on the window you want. Things might look different visually, but the paradigm is still a desktop background with windows floating over it and controls to handle them and launch new ones. And I think KDE 1 displays that perfectly. Looking at it, you could really think it's just a retro theme for the current KDE version, and I think that's pretty cool. Pretty cool, just like our sponsor, Tuxedo Computers. You probably know about them by now. They make laptops and desktops that ship with Linux pre-installed. And why that matters is because, well, you know that when you buy a device from them, Linux runs perfectly on it. I only use their computers for everything related to this channel. All my videos, all my podcasts, everything is done on one of their laptops, and all my gaming needs are served by one of their desktops. It's the Tuxedo Cube, and I run Nobara on it. They're really, really solid devices. They have a big range of computers with all price points, all power levels, and a bunch of customization options for the laptops, but also for the parts that go inside your computer. Check them out in the link in the description. They're really, really solid. Anyway, this will conclude today's video. I hope you enjoyed watching it or listening to it or whatever else you did while this ran in the background. You know where all the YouTube buttons are. Click them if you want to make the channel go up. You know how things work on YouTube. And if you want to support the channel, plenty of links to do that in the description. Thank you all for watching, and I guess you'll see me in the next one. Bye!